All right, so along came Cheryl the wobbler. Now Cheryl was a relatively young woman, and she had had some problems after surgery. She had infection, and they treated her with gentamicin, which is an antibiotic that is very hard on the inner ear and can kill the cells and the mechanisms in the inner ear. And her damage was so bad that she was always falling down. She had no sense of balance. It had destroyed that vestibular system that shows us where we are in space and how we're balanced. And so she had jerky eye motion, so she saw things like jerky, like this. It wasn't a smooth picture. And, spending all that mental energy just trying to see and trying to stand up without falling was very fatiguing, and it was mentally fatiguing. And people have committed suicide because it was such a difficult problem. So here comes Dr. Paul. Now, he was a genius. I mean, he knew, he could devise physical things to measurement in the brain. And besides knowing about the body and neurology and rehab medicine, he was an engineer, basically, developing these tools. So he fitted her with a construction hat that contained an accelerometer, which would measure, how she moved in space. And then he put a real thin plate that had electrodes on it on her tongue. And they hooked both of those things up to a computer. And so when she was hooked up to those things, when she started to move her head forward, she got these little tingly sensations on the front part of her tongue where that electrode was, because it was going off at the front part of her tongue when she moved her head forward. Felt like little champagne bubbles. When she moved her head back, she'd get the sensations on the back of her tongue. And while she was geared up like that, her body was getting biofeedback through the computer and the hat and what was on her tongue, and she could stand up straight. Before, she could not stand in one spot. The wobbling stopped. The feeling of falling all the time left. She even felt like she was falling when she was laying down. It was that bad. The jerking stopped. The demons stopped. She always felt like she was being pushed by demons. That's how it felt to her. And she was at peace. So, in that process, the sensory part of what her body was sending signals, instead of from her inner ear, now it was sending signals from her tongue, which is normally the sense of taste. It was sending the signal from her tongue to a new area in her brain that processes balance. Now, when she went off of the device, she could only stand for about a minute the first time or so. But they kept her every day. She came in, or at least several times a week, got all hooked up, and each time after she got unhooked, the balance stayed intact. She could stand. And gradually, she didn't need the device at all. She's no longer a wobbler, which is like, talk about being freed. Here's another person that really got freed from a living hell. So here's what Dr. Paul felt was going on. He felt the damaged vestibular system in the inner ear. You know, the vestibular system has these little semicircular canals in it, and there are little hairs that stick up in there, and there are tubes in there that go this way and this way and this way, so that helps you, when your head moves, there are little particles on those hairs that normally keep you in balance and sends a signal to the balance part of the brain. But Dr. Paul felt like the gentamicin damaged her vestibular system, but did not totally knock out the signals it was sending. It just sent disorganized and random signals that made it even worse for her. So the machine helped reinforce any signals that were sent by healthy tissue, and it recruited other pathways through the brain to then get to the balance center so she could be balanced. So the brain is made of many neuronal pathways, which just means nerves are all connected together and working together. And if certain pathways are blocked, the brain can use older pathways to get around them. To get an idea about how that works, we're going to watch another YouTube video.
Not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain did not change after childhood, that it was hardwired and fixed by the time we became adults. But recent advances in only the last decade now tell us that this is simply not true. The brain can and does change throughout our lives. It is adaptable, like plastic. Hence neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. How does neuroplasticity work? If you think of your brain as a dynamic, connected power grid, there are billions of pathways or roads lighting up every time you think, feel, or do something. Some of these roads are well-traveled. These are our habits, our established ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. Every time we think in a certain way, practice a particular task, or feel a specific emotion, we strengthen this road. It becomes easier for our brains to travel this pathway. Say we think about something differently, learn a new task, or choose a different emotion. We start carving out a new road. If we keep traveling that road, our brains begin to use this pathway more, and this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway gets used less and weakens. This process of rewiring your brain by forming new connections and weakening old ones is neuroplasticity in action. The good news is that we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. If you have ever changed a bad habit or thought about something differently, you have carved a new pathway in your brain and experienced neuroplasticity firsthand. With repeated and directed attention towards your desired change, you can rewire your brain.
So pretty interesting, isn't it? You could see one pathway when it wasn't being used was diminishing in size, and then when you were using the other pathway consistently, it got larger in size. So I think of it as kind of like the concept of making tracks in the snow. I've seen this happen with cross-country skiing, but we're going to use a sled this time. The first time you go down the run, the tracks are kind of light in the snow, but the more and more tracks you make, the more time you go down the run, the deeper they get. So that's the way it works in the brain. If you choose to kill the ants, kill the negative thinking, and choose a better thought instead, the positive thinking, then you will get out of the habit of thinking negatively and get into the habit of thinking positively. It's like you choose your attitude, you know? If somebody said, if you say, he makes me feel so mad, he makes me mad, he makes me mad. No, you choose to be mad, okay? You can choose a better fruit of the Spirit to react. Okay. Okay, now we're going to talk about using your brain to overcome disability from stroke and brain injuries. Here's Dr. Edward Taub, and you can read about him at that link, but he's another doctor, neuroscientist, who works with stroke patients. And very much like Dr. Paul did, his therapy is called the Taub Therapy Clinic. It's active. You can find it on the internet. And he helps stroke victims rewire their brains. Some of them were paralyzed for years, and they began to move again and speak again. And that's like a miracle, isn't it? Yeah. It's not like one of those instant miracles, but I tell you, in my practice, I saw a lot of miracles, but they weren't instantaneous. They were because people took my coaching to heart and did what they needed to do for themselves, and they got better. So he's even been able to work with children with cerebral palsy, and they've gained better control of their movements. And they're even working with people with spinal cord injuries, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, and arthritis. Now his therapy is called constraint-induced movement therapy, CI therapy. Doctors always like to put kind of fancy names on things, but all that means is you take down the strong arm or put it in a sling or something so the person can't use it, and it forces them to use their weak arm. And the more they use that weak arm or leg, the faster it makes those new tracks in the brain. So they use mitts and slings on the good arm, and they give rewards for little tiny steps. So again, adults play babies' games. They separate pennies from beans and put the pennies in a piggy bank. They push large pegs into pegboards. How many babies love to do that? They grasp large balls, and they go through all those small steps like babies do. Now, a brain map is just looking at the brain to see what area is active, and after a stroke, the brain map for the affected limb shrinks by about half, so that part of the brain isn't being activated. And it takes a lot of effort to use that affected limb when the brain looks like that. But with CI therapy, it strengthens and restores the brain map, so when the neurons get stronger, the pathways in that area of the brain get stronger, then the limb gets innervated, increased innervation. In other words, the energy flowing in the nerves improves, and so they can use it and get less tired. And at the Taub Clinic, can't is a 4-letter word. He says because of the improvement in abilities to do small but initially frustrating tasks like buttoning a button, your whole mindset can shift about what you're able to do. So just being able to button a button, accomplishing that task, gives them motivation to keep going. You know, it's all, I mean, we're all like that. We love rewards. So you're kind of self-rewarding. The more you work, the harder your work, the better the rewards come. So these are Dr. Taub's training principles. Training is more effective if the skill closely relates to everyday life. And that's what Dr. Paul said too. The training should be done in increments. In other words, don't try to do it all at once. You have to go through steps. Work should be concentrated into a short time and massive practice. So at the Taub Clinic, they practice 4 hours a day. And if you're interested in that, there's more about their therapy, and they actually have studies they're doing, and you could contact them if you know anybody that'd like to be a part of their studies. They're back east someplace though, or Midwest. I think they're in the Midwest. Okay, now that was strokes. That was anatomic damage to the brain. Now we're going to talk about behavior. How you can use your brain to overcome behavior problems. So meet Dr. Jeffery Schwartz, MD, a research psychiatrist at UCLA, and he's a leading expert in neuroplasticity. He wrote a book called Brain Lock, and this was for people who had obsessive compulsive disorder because their brains get locked, focused on one thing. Now, he developed a treatment for it after he looked at the PET scans, which is another way of scanning brains, of people with OCD. And he found out how to unlock that locked up brain. So here's how we normally deal with mistakes. We detect mistakes in the frontal cortex, right around where the eyes are. And it sends a message to this cingulate gyrus of the brain, and it triggers anxiety in us because we've made a mistake. It's, it sends signals to the heart and gut. The heart speeds up, the gut clenches, and it creates those physical sensations associated with dread. But the caudate nucleus, which isn't shown here, but it's right in this area of the basal ganglia, sits deep in the brain and helps thoughts flow from one thing to the next. But in the OCD person, the person with obsessive compulsive disorder, it gets stuck in brain lock. And so you just get this, these signals just circulate around here and keep the person doing things repetitively. Like, Howard Hughes was afraid of germs, and he would wash his hands and wash his hands and wash his hands. Well, in the OCD brain, all three of those, the prefrontal cortex, the cingulate gyrus, and the basal ganglia, are all light up. This is what their brains look like. Whereas in the normal control, you don't see those areas lit up. Now here's some OCD is thought to be a medical disorder, and therefore OCD thoughts and urges are symptoms of a medical disorder. And here's some of the common compulsions, like going back and checking over and over and over to make sure the stove's turned off, or checking to make sure you have your keys in your purse before you lock the door. I'm a little OCD about that because I don't want to lock myself out anymore. Repetitive, doctors are OCD anyway. That's the way we're trained. But, so repetitive washing and cleaning, like washing hands, or just repetition of normal activities, or having to rearrange things and reorder things all the time. Is anybody a little OCD about that? Or saving and collecting. People that, I've had a couple of friends who their houses were so stacked full of things that there was just barely a trail through the house. That's obsessive compulsive. Or mental compulsions, you just can't quit thinking about something. It's just going over and over and over in your brain. And sometimes people use repetitive images or words or numbers to try to help them reduce their anxiety. I actually think that's a part of autism to do that. Sometimes autistic children spin around too, and that's actually, what's that?
They do circles.
Circles, yeah. And it's actually a mechanism that's helping them cope, from what I understand. They may repeat special prayers or do mental counting or mental list making or mental reviewing. So Dr. Schwartz developed a treatment for OCD that would unlock the link between the orbital cortex and the cingulate gyrus and normalize the caudate. He asked himself, it's always interesting, scientists, when they're doing experiments, always ask questions. They have a hypothesis they begin with. That's part of the scientific method. And so it's interesting that all the doctors we've talked about that are looking into something have always started with a question. What was Dr. Price's question? Why did modern people have so much tooth decay? He wanted to find out why, right? Dr. Daniel Amen wanted to find out why some people could change and some couldn't. So this is what Dr. Schwartz asked. Could people shift the caudate manually by paying very close attention and actively focus on something new and pleasurable? Could they grow a new brain circuit? Sure enough, these were the therapy steps he developed. First of all, they have to recognize the lie that their brain is telling them. You have to wash your hands, you have to wash your hands, you have to wash your hands. That's a lie, isn't it? So they have to relabel what's happening. It's not an attack of germs, but rather an attack of OCD. It's brain lock. So they have to ask themselves, what's the lie they are believing? Then they remind themselves that the reason for the attack is the faulty circuit in the brain. It's not me, it's my OCD. That's the fighting weapon. It's a reminder that OCD thoughts and urges don't mean anything, that they are false messages from the brain. So in the situation of OCD, the brain has actually taken control, hasn't it? It's kept that circuit going. But the mind, when it's taught, can take charge. And so when they find themselves wanting to go wash your hands, then they refocus on a positive activity like gardening or helping another person or playing a musical instrument or listening to music or working out physically. And it can help to have another person involved in that exercise because it helps distract them and shifts their brain to another thought. And if they're driving, then they just listen to music or a CD when those thoughts start themselves. Are you guys look like you're getting sleepy to me. Are your brains starving for oxygen? Why don't we, we're not going to take a break. We'll just leave this going, but let's just stand up and stretch a minute. And then do your cross-crawl stuff. Get your brain center, get a little oxygen going, get your blood flowing. There you go. All right. We'll just do that for a minute. All right. Oh, feels good, huh? Yes. Okay. Are you awake now? If you're awake, go ahead. We'll sit down and get going again.
I'm hoping I can improve my brain.
You can. You can improve your brain. Good. All righty. Maybe having some light will help. That's a good idea. Nothing like going to sleep when it's dark, right? In fact, you really sleep best if it's a completely dark room. All right. You know, it's not easy for an OCD person to do this, but it is doable. You know, when we sit here thinking about it, it just sounds so simple and obvious, but it's not for the OCD. It takes a lot of effort in thought and in action. So they're taught to focus intently on a new activity for 15 to 30 minutes. In other words, they have to distract themselves that long. And if that's not possible, then as long as they can, at least 1 minute. It just takes time to form new circuits in the brain. And it's just like physical exercise. It takes time to build up your muscles when you start doing resistance training. So the brain's the same way. You have to build up the muscle in the brain. It's not muscle, it's nerve circuits. So this method, the 3 R's, 80% of Dr. Schwartz's patients got better, but he often combined it with an antidepressant drug like anafranil or Prozac to ease the anxiety. It just made it easier for them to practice and get their brains retrained. And eventually they can usually stop taking the drug, and some of them didn't even need it in the first place. So if you're interested in knowing more about Dr. Schwartz's methods, he has a website there, and there were some good articles I found that went over his method, which I put the link in there for you. There's so many different things you can present about the brain. Dr. Deutsch's book, The Brain That Changes Itself, has a lot more in it than I'm relating to you. So if you're interested in some other areas, I would really recommend reading it. I'll tell you what, for the type of subject matter he's covering about the brain, you know, he presents it in such a readable way. It's really easy to read. Now, Dr. Amos Clinic also assesses OCD with PET scans, so there's another link for you. And Dr. Schwartz also has some information about substance abuse and cravings. So I think it's worthwhile to watch his video now.
Hi, my name is Dr. Jeffery Schwartz. I am a research psychiatrist at UCLA, and my specialty has been for many years in obsessive compulsive disorder. And I've specialized in the treatment of obsessive compulsive disorder using a cognitive behavioral approach that takes advantage, on the one hand, of brain information. So knowing something about your brain turns out, in my approach to therapy, to have some therapeutic importance. And also, the term which has been called mindfulness, mindful awareness, and I guess over the recent past I've preferred to start calling it the impartial spectator perspective, and other terms that imply the same thing are meta-awareness and metacognition. So what are those terms mean, and what does it have to do with the brain, and why would studying obsessive compulsive disorder have any relevance to substance and pornography and other impulse control type problems? And let's take those questions sort of in the order of importance. So the most important is understanding this issue of awareness, attention, mindfulness, meta-awareness, metacognition, impartial spectator. So what do those things mean? They mostly mean paying attention to how you're paying attention. Paying attention to the quality of attention that you're paying, how much attention you're paying, being aware of where your attention is and how your attention is directed. That turns out to be a very important thing for everybody all the time, really, but it has a very large amount of importance for people with obsessive compulsive disorder and substance abuse, impulse control type problems, because in those two conditions, among others, people's attention is really driven by biological factors more, let's just say, in ways that cause problems more than in people who don't have problems like that. So that's where the beginning of the brain aspect comes in, because once you realize that a person's brain can have a lot of effects on how they direct their attention, and use the impartial spectator to realize, hey, my attention is being directed in ways that are not very beneficial to me, and specifically ask the question, why is this happening? Why does it seem so hard for me to control my attention? Why does it seem that in so many circumstances I end up getting fixated on things that I don't particularly want to be fixated on? And obviously, there's alcohol, drugs, sexual behaviors, including pornography. Those are the big categories. But it also can even include shopping and all kinds of things that people do when